So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Professor Jessica Mantell. I'm the director of the Health Law and Policy Institute here at the University of Houston Law Center. And it's my pleasure today to introduce our guest speaker, Professor Govind Persad. Professor Persad is coming to us from the University of Colorado Law School. He is a nationally recognized expert on bioethics, and much of his research focuses on access to and distribution of healthcare resources using a justice lens to look at those issues. His scholarship has appeared in leading law reviews as well as leading peer-reviewed journals in the healthcare space. He also has published op-eds in leading newspapers. He has his law degree and a Ph.D. in philosophy from Stanford University. And interestingly, before he went to graduate school, he did a fellowship at NIH in bioethics. So please join me in welcoming Professor Persad.
Thank you, and thanks, everyone. It's really an honor to be here. I grew up in Texas, actually. I'm not in Houston. I grew up in Pflugerville, just outside of Austin, but it's great to be back. It's great to be. This morning, I had some breakfast tacos, which you cannot get in Denver. They put green chili on everything. So it's great to be back in a place that does breakfast tacos properly. So today I'll be talking to you largely not about breakfast tacos. We'll talk about fair allocation of scarce medical resources, which has been a topic that I've been working on for quite a while. It actually started when I was doing the fellowship at the NIH, where at the time there were concerns about pandemic flu, and I was involved in writing a paper for a medical journal about fair allocation in that context. Then during the pandemic, I did some more work on vaccine allocation, both within the US and globally, on allocation of scarce critical care resources, of therapeutics like antivirals and so on, and approaching those questions both from a bioethical perspective and then also looking at the application of specific areas of law as well. So for instance, the potential application of equal protection law to some of the criteria that might be used, including the ones that we'll talk about today. So for today, we'll focus on a couple areas that I think were often used in policies, have sometimes been areas of controversy, and are, I think, also areas where equal protection law comes into close contact with bioethical questions about what it means to fairly allocate scarce medical resources. And if I have time, I'll also may talk a little bit about some other criteria we might look at as well that might also present interesting concerns in the realm of fair allocation. So let me do it like this. Oh, it is, no, I am having trouble advancing the slides, so I will accept some help from your IT person. All right, maybe I'm sorry. Okay, thank you so much for bearing with me on that. There's always, every time you use new computer technologies, there's always one glitch at the start. So this is a scoring system. This is one of the systems I'm going to look at in a book that is forthcoming with Cambridge called Fair Allocation in an Unfair World. And this is actually the scoring system that's used not in a US jurisdiction, but in India for allocation of deceased donor kidneys. Which is one possible scarce resource allocation dilemma. And as you'll see, there's a variety of these criteria that include both health status dimensions and age dimensions. So you have obviously right up here, you have an age dimension because you have, number 3 for the age of recipient, extra points for younger pediatric recipients. They're given higher priority for organs. That's the use of age as one criterion. Another that you see is there are some exclusion criteria where if you have, and what they put as an absolute contraindication for transplant, for instance, an inoperable cancer, or advanced untreatable CVD, those in that jurisdiction in India are treated as absolute contraindications. There are also other health-related factors, like you've had a previous graft failure of a transplant, your time on dialysis. Those are health status-related factors that play a role in allocation. And we can think both about, what potential ways that these might interact with legal rules, like legal anti-discrimination rules, and then also about ethically, what ethical objectives, are these serving? So be thinking, and we'll get to this in a little bit, why is it that we have a priority for a previous living donor or a near relative? What ethical goal is that serving? What ethical goal is it serving to look at time on dialysis or looking at those renal transplant contraindications? Another one that I think is interesting is that more recently, India actually introduced additional points, priority points, on the basis of sex or gender. So to address a gender disparity, they actually give additional points in the allocation criteria for female patients. And that would present interesting issues that I'll get to later, if time permits, under US equal protection law. So here's another one, and these two slides are busier than the slides we'll have for the rest of the talk. This is a policy for a machine called ECMO. Does anyone here know what ECMO stands for? I'm not going to cold call people because I'll cold call this gentleman. Extracorporeal membrane oxygenation. You use it generally for people who are having some type of acute heart failure, respiratory failure, or both. During COVID, it was used sometimes for acute COVID patients. It's used sometimes, these are some of the indications that are mentioned up here. And interestingly, they differentiate these based on both how long you think the person is going to need to be on ECMO and how likely they are to survive. So somebody, for instance, who is a pediatric patient who had certain heart procedures is likely to be on for not very long and to survive pretty well. By contrast, if you look at somebody who is trying to use this technology as a bridge to lung transplant, that's something where they may need to be on this, what they call, I believe, ECMO circuit much longer, and will also, based on seeing other patients of this criteria, would be expected to have lower probability of survival. And this policy suggests that if there is historically better outcomes and shorter duration of use, if demand is high, generally this should be prioritized. And going back to the theme of the talk, you also saw this differentiation between pediatric patients, which have higher predicted survival as is sort of the basis for this ECMO policy, versus adult patients post-cardiotomy, which have a lower predicted survival based on what they've seen. So these are two real-world policies, one from India. This, I believe, is the policy in Minnesota that was recommended for ECMO during COVID, that each look at health status factors and some factors related to age as well. And we should be thinking anytime we see different factors being looked at, what ethical goal, what objective are they serving? So I think in allocation, there are four main ethical aims that we are trying to realize when we're engaged in allocation. And these are first, benefits. So trying to achieve benefits like improved survival of the procedure, improved 5-year survival after a transplant. Those are examples of greater benefit. Mitigating disadvantage. So we'll talk more about this, but if we think somebody is going to be very badly off in some relevant way if they don't get a medical resource, that can be relevant not only to their benefit, that is how much better off they'll be, but even if they would only move up less than somebody else, I think that if somebody otherwise would be absolutely very badly off, and that can be in a variety of different ways, some of which we'll talk about later, that can and should matter too. A third one, and this comes up for the kidney transplant policy in India, is reciprocity. So we might think it's appropriate to recognize a past donor's contribution in order to, when doing allocation. And so that might be a form of reciprocity. During COVID, similarly, you saw some policies that prioritized health workers for access to scarce interventions. It's a little tricky with reciprocity because you might be thinking, maybe that's not reciprocity at all. It's just trying to incentivize people to donate in the future. And so it can be hard to tease apart those two motivations. And the last one is equal concern. And we'll talk more about the difference between equal concern and other things that I don't think are necessarily important, like identical treatment. But the idea of equal concern is that we should care about a benefit or a mitigation of disadvantage or reciprocity claims the same regardless of who the individual is. So if, Jessica and I, Professor Mantell and I stand to benefit the same, there's not a reason to prioritize me over her or her over me based on who we are. We might look at these other differences can be relevant, but there's not something about one of us as opposed to the other that warrants more concern. So let's bring up here now. I'm trying to do, and we'll see if this behaves on Poll Everywhere. I want to walk through now the questions that were the title of the talk. So see if you can join, and we'll see if this slide will update. So let's play around with this on Poll Everywhere. It's supposed to update, and we'll see if we'll do it. Otherwise, we'll poll. I'll just have you raise your hands. But do we think that people over age 80 should receive lower priority for transplantation than others should? Okay, so it is working some because some people have an answer up. Just leave this up a little bit. There are a couple of reasons why you might be giving this answer. One answer, and we can get to this in the Q&A, actually, I'm talking a lot. Does anybody who's willing to share who might have picked one way or the other, raise your hand and just say, if you picked A, or if you didn't, and you think it's a good reason, what's a good reason why you might have, good, we have some diversions of opinion, why we might pick A, why we might pick yes, they should have lower priority. Yes, thank you.
They've already lived a lot longer than potentially somebody else who may need it and have hopefully lived the life that they wanted, while somebody else may have more time left in their life.
Good, yeah, so this is thank you. So the answer is something like they've already lived through many years of life. I will say, so I am, at most in a tie for the person who's thought the most about this particular set of issues. The other person who has written a very good article about this is sitting here in the room with you. So it was a dangerous thing to talk about this particular topic here. But yeah, that is one of the big arguments, and one that I agree with in the book, is that if you're older, you've lived through already many years of life. And so the argument would be, in some ways, if you didn't live on longer, you wouldn't be as disadvantaged as if somebody were, I'll stereotype a little. You don't look like you're 80. You could be 80. If this happened to you, you might be more disadvantaged if you passed away right now. Yeah.
First is that if there was somebody that had an equal condition, and the person that was 80 probably needs it more than the person who's younger, if you're talking about chance of survival.
Interesting. So I don't want to deliver this too much, so I want to come back to this. When you say needs it more, my heroism stands up when people make claims of need in allocation, because my question is, needs it more for what, or what does it serve? But the thought might be, I don't want, I know you were thinking of a future answer, but let me actually ask this other person in the back in the white shirt there. Yeah.
I was just going to say that there's greater utility to be taken from a transplant to be put in someone younger. Because if we think about if the utility is extending life, then the likelihood of a transplant, will extend the life more of a 20 or 30-year-old, 40-year-old than an 80-year-old.
Yeah, so that's really nice. So thank you all for doing, I don't know if you put you up to this. So that actually gets into this sort of two different families of reasons why you might do this. One is sort of to mitigate disadvantage, you might want to prioritize people who have lived less long over ones who have lived longer. And that might be true even if their life expectancy were the same. So even if you had a pediatric patient who, say, was very sick with some other condition, and so they didn't have that good life expectancy no matter what, you might still have this disadvantage-based reason to prioritize them. Your reason is slightly different. That is that if you look over the whole population as a policy matter of 30-year-olds or even 40-year-olds like me, I'm a little older than 40, in expectation, are going to have a longer post-transplant survival than somebody who's 80. And you actually see this in transplant policy where what they do, and I believe, and there's actually an interesting debate about this at HHS when they allowed them to do this, was they age match. So if you're doing a kidney donation, you match the kidney for an older recipient. You take a kidney from an older donor. So you're trying to match the likely lifespan of the kidney with the likely lifespan of the kidney recipient. So, and that is sort of in keeping with the idea that you have different expected benefit across these two different populations. For fairness, I also want to see, some people have picked, no, you would give maybe not lower priority. That left it open the way I worded it. Maybe give them higher priority or the same. Anyone willing to either, they picked that view or they wanted to defend why they would go that way? Yes.
Well, let's say, I mean, if we're looking at it on an individual basis, the person who is younger has a very insular life and they were to just go to work and then come home and go to work, come home. And then the person who's 80 or older is a beloved grandparent and, their grandchildren are, looking forward to their weekends when they get to hang out with their grandparents, and then they're playing pickleball during the week with their friends. They have a garden they tend to. So I think their life on a social scale would be richer. And I don't know, there's a level of quality there that you want to maintain.
That's really interesting. Thank you. And that's also I appreciate you sharing that perspective looking at my audience, because I feel like you, A, numerically, and also B, we have more people, I would guess, in one age bracket than the other here. But yeah, so we see this argument. I'll get to that in I think maybe our next slide, which is that your comment sounds very similar to one that we'll get to later about either the idea of sort of greater sort of embeddedness or connectedness in your community as you get older, or certain views about some goods or aspects of quality of life that are going to be more present in older than younger recipients. I will say, actually, the empirics, again, I have people who are more experts than me about this here, but I think that the psychological literature suggests that people's self-reported life satisfaction tends to increase with age. So actually, people report higher life satisfaction later on. I don't know to what extent this is cross-cultural, but you often see this phenomenon. So that now, there's an independent question of justice we'll get to. Is it appropriate, is it fair to make allocation decisions based on a judgment about the other person's quality of life? And I actually think that generates a lot of hard legal and ethical problems. But that is a reason why you might engage in that allocation. So anyway, I want to make sure that I leave more time for questions at the end. So I'll go on. I'll try to when I do the polls, because I enjoy hearing you talk more than hearing me talk. So here are some reasons, again, why prioritize younger candidates. You've seen these already. So the first one we sort of talked through, people who die early have less time alive. So this gravestone, I was thinking about this. I've been writing the book already, but I went to this cemetery in Colorado called Central City Cemetery with my kids on vacation. We were like going up to the mountains for a weekend. And there were all these graves there. And if you look at this grave, it was like in keeping with a lot of the other graves, where the people who died were like the age of my kids who are in kindergarten and first grade. And now, obviously, given what I've just said, I may be biased, but there is a sense, I probably am biased, but I think there is a really vivid sense in which there is something especially bad about somebody dying born in 1894 in 1900, as opposed to die in 1894 and they die in 1994 or 1984. And I think a big part of this is that having less time alive is a disadvantage. It is, we all generally hope, other things being equal, to have more time instead of less. It's not the only thing we care about. We care about how our life goes as well. But this is not the sort of life that we would have wanted to have for ourselves. We've all made it past this danger of passing away at 6 here, I think. And we wouldn't want this, again, as a parent, I was like, this is something where, I don't expect that my kids are going to live forever, but if this happened to them or happened to anybody's kids that I know, I would find it not that I find anyone dying to be good, but there's something especially bad about an early or a premature death. And I think you see these in policy. The other is the argument that we talked about before, which is that generally preventing an earlier death leads to more time gained. So younger age of treatment leads to more time gained after treatment, which one of the commentators just mentioned. And then also for a lot of procedures, and we saw this with the pediatric cardiotomy, younger age at treatment is associated with greater odds of success. So a treatment is just more likely to work if you do it in a younger patient. We actually saw this with ventilators during COVID. There were some interesting studies about that later on. So what are some objections to using age? So it gets back to the question sort of from the person in the sort of greenish blazer. Yeah, more time alive might, actually, this is a little bit different. This gets more to the reciprocity one. I'll come back to that. So the first one is that you might say more being alive for longer is not necessarily being better off. Somebody might be alive for 80 years, but they might have had 80 years that were very hard, not very pleasant, difficult in various ways. They were disadvantaged in certain respects. Maybe by contrast, somebody like the gravestone on the last slide, maybe they had a very wonderful 6 years of life. I just think that the problem with this is going to be it's very, very rare the differences in how somebody's life goes over a substantial difference in length, that greater sort of experience, quality of experience over 6 years is going to outweigh what somebody does over 80 years. I also think these kinds of judgments tend to be really challenging, maybe impossible to administer, and intrusive. So if you're a transplant allocator, I think it's fairly easy to determine what age somebody is. It's both really hard to administer and involves potentially intrusive and demeaning inquiries to try to figure out, so what have your years and stages been like to do allocation? Another argument you see is you might say, well, earlier death isn't necessarily more time gained. So going back to the very first answer to my question, you could have a kid that's really sick. And so maybe there are some, 40-year-olds or 20-year-olds who aren't going to live any longer than an 80-year-old transplant recipient. And in fact, the American Geriatric Society has argued that instead of looking at age, we should look at functional trajectory, multimorbidity, and frailty as predictors of life expectancy instead of age. I think there's a problem with that, which is the second part of the talk, which is that if you look at being in worse health, that will tend to exacerbate disadvantage in a way that looking at age will not tend to. Considering age violates equal concern, some worry there's something especially unjust about membership in a class, determining whether you get health care. This is a sort of equal protection idea. I don't find this compelling because I think there's always going to be membership in some class. So say that you do it based on first come, first served, or based on lottery numbers. There's going to be a class of lottery losers or people who showed up later who don't get scarce healthcare. I think the question is whether there are some classes we think it's unjust to have priority based on. And I think for the reasons that I've talked about earlier, I think age is an appropriate one because age is correlated both with being older age is correlated both with being more advantaged in certain respects and is correlated with generally having less benefit from the intervention. I'm not going to go back to reciprocity because I think my respondent answered it better than I did about, exactly, I think basically what you were saying. Older somebody becomes, the more intricately interwoven they are in lives. This is a quote from a paper, I think that was actually doing empirical surveys of respondents in some non-US cultures. A last objection, I think this last one is the best objection, but it would have such revisionary implications that I don't think anybody would want to go down this way of thinking, is that you could say, well, there aren't really any 80-year-olds or possibly even 40-year-olds because people don't maintain the same identity over the whole course of their life. So like the good things I experienced, back when I was 20, those aren't advantages that count, as part of the goods I've experienced now when I'm 80. We're just looking at sort of a very short time slice of a person and allocating based on what's going on with them right now. I think the problem with this is just that if we really thoroughgoingly went with this view, it would have very challenging implications for things like, do I have a mortgage anymore? Am I married? Do I have kids that I have parental responsibilities or rights with respect to? So Alan Buchanan and Dan Brock, who are bioethicists, have written about this topic. And so I think this just ends up being, I think, very tricky to go down this path. Legal arguments come up as well. And actually, I may save some of these more for the Q&A because we'll see if we get, but I'll just sort of give a brief run through of this. You can just read Professor Mantel's article if you want to read more about these. But yeah, federally, constitutionally, you have a rational basis review generally for age. So age is not a suspect class under the federal constitution. But there are important statutes and regulations that do offer more protection. So the Age Discrimination Act of 1975 does place somewhat more restrictions on the use of age in certain policies. There are a lot of carve-outs from this compared to the anti-discrimination rules you may be more familiar with. So they actually have a complete carve-out for any distinction made in a local, state, or national policies passed by like a legislative body. That is a pretty big difference. So that would permit, say, if a state allowed age distinctions. Another one is that if it has to do with, remember, the normal operation or statutory purpose of a policy. So there are many more carve-outs for using age than there are for others. There are also some state-level statutes that may impose further restrictions. And I think there's a paper recently that suggests that more states are adopting protections, equal protection restrictions with respect to age, maybe motivated by sort of changes in social norms. It may be motivated by the fact that in the US in particular, older adults tend to be quite effective at utilizing political power because they're a group that tends to have really high voting rates. And so that may lead to state statutes being more protective here. Go on and talk about this other one, which is going to be about health status. So we'll go through health status, and then I think once we talk about health status, I'll just stop there and we can take questions. So say you have stage 4 cancer. Should you have lower priority for transplant? I picked this example actually because my mom passed away from cancer. I will say, to put my cards on the table, I actually do think somebody who has stage 4 cancer, which she had at one point, should get lower priority for transplant. That doesn't settle the question of whether I'm right, but I hope it goes some way where it's showing that it's not just like purely academic. I haven't been in the position of being somebody with stage 4 cancer, but I do think that there is a legitimate case, not a case of sort of unthoughtful discrimination where you would prioritize lower for people with stage 4 cancer. We saw that there. For reasons of time, I'll sort of save comments for the questions. I think a lot of the arguments are going to come out similarly as with age, but there's going to be an important difference. So one reason why you would prioritize people that don't have stage 4 cancer is that if you have stage 4 cancer, generally your life expectancy is not that long. It's pretty truncated. You're not going to get a lot of benefit out of giving an organ to that person. The flip side is that unlike being 80, having stage 4 cancer is, I'll just go on to the next slide actually here, is quite a disadvantage right now and is correlated with other disadvantages. So you can run into more of a square sort of tension between the goal of benefiting people and mitigating disadvantage. So I was doing this for ECMO, but yeah, if you have advanced cancer, you have poor odds of a treatment working, poor odds of surviving for a long time, even if it does work, and you're going to be in pain and have various pretty severe functional limitations often. Now, you can imagine there are certain stage 4 cancers that you have very good treatments for now compared to others. Certain blood cancers are much more treatable than, stage 4 pancreatic cancer. But if you look at the inoperable malignancy criteria in the India policy, I think it's pretty similar to what I'm talking about here. But the flip side, as I said, is that having advanced cancer is a disadvantage in a way that being, older isn't. Like, I think many of us, or maybe all of us, are hoping to live to be older. Maybe we get that we're going to have to die at something at some point. We're maybe hoping that the way that we pass away is not from having advanced cancer, although I could actually think of, not that it's great, I can think of worse things to have. I'm serious. If you look at what people dread the most, it is probably going to be certain kinds of, for instance, conditions that have incurable, very severe pain, or certain kinds of dementias are actually feared more. From my mom's experience, I would say if the pain management was dealt with okay, that was fine. And if you also advanced cancer tends to be associated with other disadvantages at the same age. So if you look at who lives to be 80 or 70 in the US, it's correlated with having higher income, all kinds of things. If you look at who develops cancer earlier, if you look at like a map of, cancer alleys in various jurisdictions, it tends to be correlated with other forms of disadvantage. So the tension is that it's something that gives you poorer benefit, but you're also more disadvantaged. I am missing a slide, which is actually fine. I'm going to talk about, there's a slide before I get to the better option that I'll just talk through now, and then I'll talk about this, and we'll talk about the law a little bit, and then we'll do questions. So to try to deal with the problem of a tension between achieving more benefit, but not wanting to further disadvantage already disadvantaged people, what a lot of guidelines have gone with are things like saying, well, to solve this problem, what we're going to say is we're going to ignore smallish differences in prospective benefit. So we'll ignore whether somebody's like 90 versus 75% likely to survive. Or we'll ignore differences in post-treatment survival. So a really common move you saw, and actually I think a lot of guidance and the final rule from HHS has suggested that they think this is somehow required by pre-existing statute. I don't agree with this, is that it's like not okay to consider 5-year survival because it's discriminatory. I don't think that's right, because I think if you look at what we care about when we're doing non-scarcity chemo or transplant, or when we think about our own lives, is of course we care about things like 5-year or 10-year or even 20-year survival. I don't think it's a discriminatory or impermissible criterion to look at. I think the problem is that we should be worried that it might exacerbate disadvantage. But that's different than saying like it doesn't matter, or it's irrelevant, or it's discriminatory. There's a paper that I wrote a response to that said, well, we shouldn't care, we should only care about does the patient survive to hospital discharge, because like only that is the goal of medicine. And I just don't think that's an accurate description of the goal of medicine, to be like only surviving to hospital discharge is the goal. I think the really legitimate concern is that there are people whose medical conditions shorten their survival, that we don't want to pile disadvantage on top of disadvantage. So one option, this is an option that actually, so I've defended, and some very thoughtful law professors who don't agree with me about some of this stuff have also defended, is to say if you're worried about mitigating disadvantage, what we should do is have a priority system where we take some subset of transplants or whatever we have, and we prioritize people who are coming in disadvantaged in some ways. So if we're worried, for instance, here's an example where I think this works well for, is say if you're looking at long-term survival, you might be worried about people that have certain conditions that shorten expected survival, like say Down syndrome, and you might want to have fair access for them. And one way of doing that might be to have some resources in a priority category that improves access if you're disadvantaged, or where maybe you don't look at, maybe you do random selection or don't look at that for some subset of the supply. The problem with this doctrinally, and I was reminded of this in writing in this area, is that US anti-discrimination law in particular tends to be pretty individualistic. And so even though picking this rule that improves access might be better for the population of people with pre-existing health conditions on the whole, it won't necessarily be better for the candidates whose health status makes them less likely to benefit from that intervention. So if you have like a disadvantaged or health status-based priority for transplants, you may still end up picking out the people who have, some pre-existing condition, but nevertheless are expected to benefit a lot, as opposed to the people who have a pre-existing condition. And so for that reason, they aren't expected to benefit that much. I think that actually is fine if your goal is to narrow health disparities, and that's the goal I care about. But if you care about protecting those particular candidates who aren't going to benefit as much, then it won't really do that work. And then you have, again here, the sort of intersection of this with law. So again, constitutionally, health status, there is not a federal constitutional protections that would really apply to considering health status. That's not a category that is, again, like ethnicity or gender considered a suspect category. But you do have federal statutes. So the ADA, the Rehabilitation Act, Section 1557 of the ACA, that apply, these are generally framed as disability as opposed to health status discrimination protections, but those can limit the extent to which health status can legitimately be looked at. We can talk more about this, but for instance, in the final rule on interpreting, I believe, Section 504 and 1557, there was some suggestion by the agency that in general, like you shouldn't look at multi-year survival, or there's been some suggestion, for instance, that quality of life determinations are not appropriate to look at. Ethically, I have more sympathy actually for the view that quality of life determinations are fraught with a lot of trouble. I am not as sure that there's anything in the text of the ADA or 57 that says you can't do them, but that's a matter of text versus ethics. You also have state disability laws, and then also certain sort of very particular laws that limit certain kinds of health status discrimination. One of your distinguished former professors, I don't know if any of you all would have had her by this point, Professor Jessica Roberts, who is here, has this book called Healthism. And there are certain laws that do particularly target certain kinds of health discrimination. So I think Montana has a law where you can't treat people differently based on whether they have or haven't received vaccine. And so that is another area. And that could come up because sometimes vaccine is used as a transplant criteria where that could come into play. So I'm going to stop here to leave time for questions, and I will look forward to your thoughts and comments. Yes.
So you mentioned, you alluded to a lot of anti-discrimination laws, emphasize that to the extent possible, assessments or evaluations of people should be based on individual circumstances rather than using a category like age, disability, or gender. So, what's your response then when people say you therefore shouldn't use age because we need to treat individuals as unique people that they are?
Thank you so much. Yeah, so a common requirement, certainly in these anti-discrimination laws, is that there be an individualized assessment. I think there are a couple of questions here that I think are challenging. One is, the first is, especially, and something that I want to think about more for this book is, in the era of having improved things like AI, not LLMs, but the kind of AI you use for radiology, would an individualized assessment requirement preclude feeding in your age, which is a fact about you, into an individualized assessment model? The typical concern about individualized assessment that I've had, and I know Professor Janet Malik, who's over at BCM, has written about this, is individualized assessment can get to be challenging to do practically in certain kinds of, you can do it, I think, for organs. And in practice, organ transplant, in the end, you end up doing an individualized assessment in the scoring system, although informed by factors like age, but you have a little more time. I think the argument, and I'm actually not sure, there was one case that I found when writing about this that said, in a time exigency where like time is of the essence, you can relax it a little bit. If you had some like burn disaster and you had 100 people show up and you don't have enough blood products, to what extent can you use more blanket exclusions there? Because what would it really, does the requirement to individually assess become qualified when the time that it would take to individually assess isn't present? I think part of it is the individual assessment requirement makes a lot of sense, is sort of fit well for non-scarcity scenarios, because you want, in sort of ordinary medicine, you don't want people to sort of be going with a gut feeling, and going back to the American Geriatric Society thing, saying, oh, we're just never going to give something to somebody who's 80 or something to somebody who has this pre-existing disability. But under scarcity, I think there is an easier to understand non-discriminatory reason why you might do some of those things that isn't just based on animus or a lack of understanding. So I think maybe to give one last answer is that I wonder about to what extent the individual assessment requirement is meant to be a proxy for ensuring that the decision is evidence-based, and to what extent an evidence-based decision made by something like a transplant allocation score counts as individual assessment, even though I don't get the opportunity and like the lung allocation score to, put forward all of the details of my own personal medical record. It must have to, because the lung allocation score or like kidney allocation in the US isn't violative of the, what do you have a thought about why it doesn't violate the individual assessment requirement? Like, why don't I get to go back in and have my, doctor plead my case about, yeah, sure, he doesn't, based on these numbers, he doesn't look like a good candidate, but, look at all these other individualized details about his life.
I mean, I feel like that would be really impractical, right? Because
Well, that's
that
what,
just
yeah.
introduces other
Mhm.
bias, right? I mean, there's a lot of evidence that physicians who might, believe that they are neutral and treating patients equally, subconsciously, we all have biases that can come into play. So I think, and every doctor too is going to feel like I'm supposed to just, lawyers, right? We're all supposed to like advocate vigorously for our clients. But a lot of doctors would too, and you just have like a battle of the doctors. Right?
But that's an ethics argument. I'm curious. We can talk about this a little more later. Let's take other questions. Like doctrinally, though, I'm still a little stuck on whether like we're going to have an individual assessment problem, even though I think we may both agree that like individual assessment is not a panacea for getting rid of implicit bias, and in fact, it may sometimes make it worse. Is that behind?
Well, I was just wondering, evaluating the contributions to society. You have two people, maybe equal age, maybe one's 80 and one's 40, and the 40-year-old is on parole and was convicted of a violent crime. I mean, there are other ways to value life. So I sort of agree with Jessica.
Yeah, I mean, so I have a couple concerns about. I actually do think there's more to be said for certain kinds of backward-looking things. And if you look at surveys of the public, people are willing to say that there should be. The members of the public are actually willing to say that people who have genuinely committed a serious wrong against the community should have lower priority for things like transplants. Bioethicists and doctors hate this and do not like to do it. I actually think the public has more going for their view than the bioethicists think they do. But I think that there is going to be the thing that I don't like that I struggle with about things like contribution to the community is sort of twofold. One is that I think it is going to be very, very challenging. Well, three things. One is it's going to be quite challenging to administer that, because there's a lot more subjectivity and disagreement about what it means to have contributed to the community than what it means to, have lived for X many years or have X probability of survival. Another is that I might worry that might be more likely to exacerbate disadvantage, because often if you're disadvantaged, it might be harder to do certain things that the public would recognize as like a community contribution. And the third is that with respect to reciprocity or community contribution, I might think like the fitting way of reporting that isn't necessarily, so I'm working for my thing, through transplant, or through giving out scarce healthcare resources. So there's a really big difference maybe in how much two people could benefit from a scarce resource. And I struggle with the idea that we should forego so much benefit and maybe exacerbate disadvantage so much more to properly recognize reciprocity. Instead, maybe what we should do is like primarily look at disadvantage and benefit, and then to the extent people have really contributed to the community, recognize that contribution in, some way other than priority for scarce resources. So, you have various forms of symbolic recognition or recognition through, all-purpose resources or financial rewards as opposed to through a transplant. But I take the point. I think the question about reciprocity is a very good one. Yes.
We haven't talked at all about the economics of this, and I admit that I teach health economics, so quality adjusted life years and stuff, and this is what I instantly go to and sort of saying, it's perfectly obvious to me that transplanting somebody who's 40 versus 80 is a much better economic deal. So how do you factor the economics of all this, especially in a country like the United States spends so much more money than other countries do, and so much of it
Yeah, so I agree. I agree with you about the idea that you'd get much more benefit, and the quality of adjusted life here is one way of measuring, of assessing benefit. My tendency has been to think that you shouldn't use the quality adjusted life year to do this, because I think the quality piece of it ends up being A, sort of impractical to assess, and B, I worry more about it magnifying disadvantage. But I think if you looked at like, the monetary value of years of life, which people also monetize, clearly. Now, with respect to, in some ways, we kind of shield off scarce resource decisions from monetization, at least in our heads, where I'm not sure that sort of, you can always convert with like values of a statistical life or something else, those things into money. I tend to think I'm not sure I'm getting more by doing that, in part because we want to kind of keep the two spheres separate. But yeah, I don't think we should talk more after we get the chance, but like, I don't have any quarrel with using a health economic concept like years of life saved or quality adjusted life years. I'm not sure if I would want the dollars per part of it to come into scarce resource decisions, although I'm open to sort of thinking about how that would work. Is there a question? Yes?
On the health status part of your presentation, do you believe there's a reliance interest for those who've already had a transplant but that transplant has failed?
Oh, that's really, so the question is about, is there a reliance interest for people who previously received a transplant, their transplant failed, and then they are in the pool for another one? So for in that example, I actually don't think so, but there are other cases where I could imagine the interest being stronger. Like if you're, yeah, so it doesn't seem, is it sort of psychological? Because in some ways, if anything, so at most I would think, no, it should be the same claim as anybody else's. And at worst, I would actually think there's a sense in which somebody who hasn't even had a chance should get another chance before they get a second bite of the apple of the transplant, as it were. Where I have maybe a different view is I could imagine, I think this gets trickier, if somebody is already on ECMO, even though they're maybe not benefiting that much, they don't have that much chance of improving, and they're going to be on it for a long time, they may have a reliance interest on staying on, even if somebody shows up who is likely to benefit a lot more quickly, and maybe would be more disadvantaged if they didn't get ECMO. There might still be like a reliance interest in continuing to receive what you're receiving. But if your transplant failed already, it is not clear to me why that would give you a like greater psychological expectation that has like legal or moral weight to like further transplants. So that's my initial thought about it. But I'd love to like learn more about how this is dealt with in practice. Yes.
I'm just curious what your thought is on when disadvantages, quote unquote, are turned more into an advantage in the selection process. Like I know we saw that with the COVID vaccine, the more comorbidities you had, the higher likely they're going to put you higher on the list. And so then aren't we kind of counting it as it just kind of troubles me to say, well, no, don't count it to disadvantage them in this sector, but we can count it to advantage them in this sector if what we're looking at is maybe just years benefit gained or utility gained based on the treatment.
Yeah, that is a wonderful question. Actually gets to, So I really like the question that's framed in, So I just would say, I think it's totally fine to consider disadvantage in order to advantage people. And I am troubled when disadvantage is considered to further disadvantage people, because I think this goes to the thing in anti-discrimination law between like anti-classification approaches and approaches that try to avoid subordinating or magnifying disadvantage. And the thought is, go back to the case of cancer. I'm not concerned at all about giving people with cancer priority for a COVID vaccine or something like that, in part because that seems like a case where potentially they might both benefit more and be more disadvantaged. It's different from something where I think there is a legitimate case to be made for this is just a forbidden thing that we shouldn't look at when allocating, so something like religion maybe. Something like a health status factor, it's not a forbidden ground. It's just that it's a ground that we don't want to magnify disadvantage based on, but it's not a forbidden ground. So I think health status or age is going to be different from like religion in that respect. I had slides which we're not going to get to. I'm happy to talk about this more here or after. I think race is a really tricky one to think about in this respect. I have come around to the view of thinking that it would be intensely unadministrable, and that is the reason not to do it. But I think they're really tricky. And legally also, I don't think you could do it legally. But ethically, I think there are very tricky questions around that. More hands or questions? Yes, in the back.
So it seems like there's really no winning in any argument or any class that you decide to base off your status, health status, or any outside health status classifications. And as I think about it, as we're weighing the pros and cons, I'm just thinking about how multiple different things impact people's health and lifestyles and choices and impact their health status, which will compound disadvantages for certain groups of people. So food deserts, for example, or being in a gerrymandered state or a gerrymandered zone, school zone or something like that. Being in a highly dense city, having less money, so you're more likely to do crime because you need to steal for food or things like that. All those things are systematic things that we have in our society that disadvantage some people more than others. And so when you're looking at all these other things that you're saying, well, maybe this would be better or maybe that would be better, should we then be looking at the things that get you all the way to those points? Because a lot of these things that you're saying or others are saying are endpoints for all the things that add up to get you to those places. So trying to not disadvantage one person or one group or whatever at those endpoints may lead to just disadvantaging them regardless.
That's great. Yeah, so I want to give two answers to that. This is a question really about sort of background. To what extent, if you allocate based on health status, the way you put it, are you then differentially impacting people based on what the background causes of them ending up in a given health status or circumstance is? So what I would say is, the one thing I would say is that this is one of the reasons why I like age as a criterion, is that in general, one thing that is in common among all of the sort of disadvantaging societal circumstances that we see is that pretty much all of them tend to shorten lifespan. And so that is the way in which I think if you use age as the criterion, that concern comes up less. For health status, I think it is a really big concern. And here's the example that I have in the book chapter that I struggle with, and I'll be curious, raise your hands about this one. So say those of you who thought that there should be somewhat lower priority for stage 4 cancer, which I also think for transplant. What if you had a situation where somebody had stage 4 cancer, but the reason why was that unjustly some people had released a carcinogen into the water supply, and it had differentially affected people in a disadvantaged neighborhood, and they ended up being a cancer cluster because of that. And now you have this person who has, inoperable stage 4 cancer, but the way they ended up there wasn't through sort of bad luck, but it was through injustice. Do I still think that should affect, is it okay to, so let me actually see if I can get a show of hands. Who thinks that it would be still permissible to have, I'm not saying a categorical exclusion, somewhat lower priority if it's just a fact. It is really unjust. It is horrible. This person ended up in this situation, but they have, inoperable stage 4 cancer, or best understanding of their expectancy is they have life expectancy of a year. Is it permissible to consider that as a factor, their only 1 year life expectancy against them in allocation? Who thinks it is permissible to consider that? Who thinks in this case, I think it's a harder case, that it's not, that it would be impermissible to look at it? So now I feel like I should change my view and say it's impermissible, because I was trying to make the best, but are you, but I am troubled because I feel like it is really piling disadvantage on disadvantage. So, yeah. So yes, sir.
So this is a question I'm trying to work out as I ask it, and so I really apologize. But when we talk about scarcity of resources, typically in the United States, we tend to assign, and I don't want to say moral judgments, but value judgments about whether or not this person deserves access to this scarce resource. That includes everything from luxury handbags to healthcare to food. In a lot of these examples, there's very little control over how we get to these points. Everyone's going to age. You can't really, cancer is hard to predict, happens for random reasons. How do we, And that's kind of my question is, when you don't have control and you have these moral judgments, and so it seems obvious to a lot of people, yes, this person deserves it, no, this person doesn't. How do we talk about this, like, absent those value judgments that we all kind of intrinsically have? And this last question kind of
Yeah.
brought the question full in focus.
So, yeah, so I think that when you talk about deservingness, it's tricky for me because it's sort of ambiguous between, there are two ways that you can use the word. One is overall how ethically, maybe legally strong your claim should be. And there, I think absolutely you should give out scarce resources to people that have stronger claims. And one way of having a stronger claim is that you'll benefit more. Another way of having a strong claim is that you'd be more disadvantaged without it. Another way of having a strong claim is that you have claims of reciprocity or recognizing what you've contributed. And people also use deservingness in this narrower sense that means something more like it has to have been under your control in that way. And I think in my response to the person with the white jacket, I think that backward-looking deservingness considerations of whether it's under your control should have like a subordinate or less important place in deciding who gets what than considerations of how disadvantaged you would be or how much you would benefit. So I think those two things should be primary, but I wouldn't rule out entirely considerations of looking back. The tricky thing, I think, especially about considerations of, so I would reject the proposition that like you can only allocate toward or away from somebody if the circumstance is under their control, because like age isn't under your control. Having unluckily cancer isn't under your control. And I think it can be so tricky to administer judgments about whether something was someone's fault. So going back to the question about like, can committing a violent crime be a legitimate basis for lower priority? I have some sympathy for that view, but I also have sympathy for the view that like, at the same time, there are different circumstances under which somebody might commit a violent crime. And if like I went and committed a violent crime, I sort of think I should get lower priority at this point because I'm not in a position that I am faced with like the need to commit a violent crime for reasons of survival. But if somebody else were, I think it gets to be a trickier question.
Join me in thanking Professor Persad.
Thank you all. This is a lot of fun and really useful for me in my own writing. I find hearing what other people have to say about these issues just immensely valuable in doing my own work.